I want to thank you so much for joining us today. And I want to thank the Center for Inclusive Policy for hosting the webinar, with special thanks to Paulina Ricci for doing all the organizational work and making it happen. I'm Jennifer Maddens. I'm the chair of the Washington Group on Disability Statistics, and I'm also a senior advisor at the Center for Inclusive Policy, and I'll be acting as your moderator for the webinar today. Today, we'll be exploring a key question. Why do disability prevalence estimates differ across data sources? This particular webinar grew out of a session that we had at a Washington Group annual meeting a couple of years ago, where we started the conversation about why disability prevalence estimates might differ. And we promised that we would continue the conversation in a more in-depth through a webinar, and this is the fulfillment of that promise. Estimates of disability prevalence within the same country often do vary across different data sources, and this creates a whole lot of confusion for policymakers in particular, but also for researchers and other data users who are attempting to interpret the data. Today, we want to explore why disability prevalence estimates vary across data tools, and then we'll address what these differences mean for interpreting the disability data. We're going to start with that video.
What is the prevalence of disability?
The disability prevalence rate tells us the percent of the population with disabilities. The first step in calculating the prevalence rate is to identify who has disabilities. But identifying those with and without disabilities is not always straightforward. This is because not all disabilities are visible. In addition, disability and functioning exist along a continuum, and people can have various levels of difficulties when doing different kinds of activities. As a result, there is not one single population with disabilities, but many.
The population with disabilities is identified by picking a cutoff point on the functioning continuum. There are many possibilities, and it is important to have a clear reason for collecting the data so the best cutoff point for that purpose is chosen. Take walking, for example. Some people cannot walk at all. Others can walk on flat roads and paths, but only for short distances. Some can walk for long distances, and some people can run marathons. The cutoff point selected on the walking continuum depends on the reason why we need to know people's level of functioning.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to now turn this over to Dan Mont, who will do the first part of the presentation on why disability prevalence estimates differ. Dan?
Thanks, Jennifer. Yes, people get very confused sometimes or upset when there's a great variance in the published estimates of the prevalence of disability. And there's many reasons why those estimates can differ, and it's important to understand that in order to be able to evaluate and interpret the data that we get. So next slide. So the first group of reasons why disability prevalence estimates might differ is that they take a different approach to estimating, to identifying what is meant by disability, right? There could be questions that just ask, do you have a disability? There could be questions that are focused on medical reasons, medical diagnoses. There could be questions that are based on program eligibility. Do you have a disability certificate, which is a function of many things, the program rules, the access to the program, or they could be questions based on functional limitations. How much difficulty do you have doing various activities? And sometimes there's a combination. For example, in the Thai National Disability Survey, they ask questions about functional difficulties, and they also ask questions about impairments. So if different tools use different types of questions, they're going to identify different groups of people. But even if we have two data tools, two surveys or two census or whatever, that take the same basic approach, let's say a functional limitation approach, they can still have a lot of differences. Um, for example, they might have different numbers of functional domains, right? You might have the Washington Group short set that has 6 questions on certain domains compared to the extended set, which asks additional domains like anxiety and depression, which are not in the short set. Or it could be the child functioning module, which has a lot of questions that pertain to children's difficulties that are particularly important for children's development. Or you could have the Model Disability Survey, which has a whole bunch of questions on functionality. So the more questions I ask, the more domains I ask, the different number of people I'm going to get. Also, just because I'm having functional questions, there could still be differences. For example, the Washington Group questions has a scaled response, as the video talked about, from not able to do something all the way to having no difficulty, but a grade. But some surveys just ask yes or no. Do you have difficulty doing this? Yes or no. Again, you ask the question differently, you're going to get a different number. Or you can have a question that's not written very well. For example, combining multiple function domains in a single question. Some surveys say, oh, do you have difficulty walking, seeing, hearing, blah, 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 all in one question? Very difficult for a respondent to process that information. You could have questions that say, have you had difficulty walking for at least 6 months or longer, right? So once you begin to change the question, add clauses, you're going to get different results, even if the underlying approach of, say, functional difficulty is being taken. And finally, even if we say all agree on a certain set of questions, a very common set is recommended by the UN Statistical Divisions, the Washington Group short set, even if they're using those questions, there could be implementation issues. The questions cannot be answered correctly. For example, sometimes a survey will say, we're now going to ask you some questions about disability, which is something we do not want you to do because it affects the way people think of the questions. Um, we can also have a numerator error in how the questions are delivered. We could have poor translation. For example, one of the Washington Group questions is, do you have difficulty remembering or concentrating? We've seen translations where instead of remembering, it turned into memorization. Memorization is very different than remembering. So a poor translation can affect how uh, people respond to the question. There's other reasons as well that come in with implementation. For example, proxy response versus self-response. There's a difference between asking the head of the household about everybody in the household versus asking each individual person as well. So depending on how they go. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. So reasons why survey results in the same country may differ. Um, for example, let's say you have 2 surveys in the country. Let's say they're both using the same set of questions, say the Washington Group questions. Proxy versus self-response is something I just mentioned. Also, placement within the survey. Let's say it's a health survey and you've just asked all these health questions and then you ask the Washington Group questions. You might get different responses because of the frame of mind of the respondent compared to the same questions in a labor force survey, where you've just asked all these questions about work behavior and then you ask the questions. So, where the questions are placed in the survey is important, and what other questions surround those questions are going to influence how the respondents think about things and the process that goes on in their mind when they're answering the question. Another reason things can differ is the sampling frame. For example, a census tries to reach everybody in the country. A survey is based on a sampling frame, and quite often those sampling frames exclude the institutionalized population, or they exclude homeless people, people who are not housed. And therefore, if people with disabilities are disproportionately in those groups, they're going to be missed in the survey, while hopefully they are captured in the census. That can drive a difference. Another problem with sampling, or another issue, I should say, with sampling is there are non-respondents. Sometimes you go to a house, you knock on the door, and the person's there and they answer the questions, or the person's not there and you have to move on and you have to try to account for that statistically. Well, if people with disabilities are more likely to be home because they're trapped at home because of barriers in the environment, or if they're less likely to be home because they're institutions or whatever, that is going to affect the results, right? And so if I have two countries and or an urban area and a rural area, let's say within the same country, and people with disabilities are much more likely to be at home in one place than another, they're more likely to be respondents in the survey. That's going to affect things. There's all these different ways. But a really important thing is, as was mentioned in the video, is the threshold that we use to identify people with disabilities, right? Are we saying that people who cannot do a basic activity, those are the ones who have a disability? Are we saying it's the people who have a lot of difficulty? Or are we going to include people who have, say, some difficulty in multiple areas? All these people have different levels of difficulties functioning, which in interaction with barriers in the environment can create exclusion. So where we draw the cutoff can really depend on why we're collecting the data. If we're trying to figure out, oh, what children in school might have difficulties that they require some sort of support in the school, our threshold might be at a very different place than if we're trying to identify people who we think should be receiving disability pensions from the government, right? So the different reasons behind drawing the line are going to affect where we draw the line. Next slide. So, and then let's say we've got that all figured out. We've chosen the questions that we think are most appropriate. We've chosen the threshold that we think is the most appropriate. We've have good implementation. One thing I should have mentioned before in terms of implementation, the difference between censuses and surveys is enumerators in surveys tend to be much better trained than enumerators in censuses. They tend to have more experience, there's more time for training, and therefore the quality of the enumeration might be better than in a census, which is a huge enterprise, and a lot of people are brought in for a one-time thing every 10 years to do this. So the quality of the enumeration might be different. Sorry, I forgot to mention that in the last slide. But now let's say we have the questions we want, we have the threshold defined, we have good questions, we have good implementation, we have good translation, we have a really good sense of that we're collecting the data that we want to collect. Then why might the prevalence rates be very different between two different countries, right? Why might it be 5% one place, 15% for in another? Well, one very important thing to consider is the age distribution, because age is very highly correlated with disability. So if we have a country with an aging population, that is going to be a driver towards a higher prevalence of disability. We have a country with a very young population, that's going to be a driver towards a lower prevalence estimate of disability. So when we compare from country to country, we really like to try to adjust for the age distribution to see if the underlying sort of causes of disability might be different in different countries. Because there are different causes, right? A country that's experiencing conflict, a country that's experiencing food insecurity and high rates of malnutrition, let's say, a country that has very high rates of traffic accidents, or there are various different causes. They're going to play out differently in different countries. We don't expect every country to have the same rate of disability. Sometimes people come to me and say, "Oh, but I've heard that there's 16% of the global population has a disability, and I'm only getting 9%. I must be doing something wrong." Well, not necessarily, right? It could be that's an average, and people are going to be distributed across that average. Another important thing is not just the causes of disability, but the survival rates of people with disabilities. Let's think about traffic accidents. If I'm in a country that has a very poor healthcare system, if I'm in a traffic accident, my mortality rate might be much higher. But if I'm in a country with a better healthcare system, that mortality rate might be lower, but it might leave traffic accident victims with issues with disability, or even diseases, or various causes of disability are sometimes also causes of mortality. And so we can one study I did in one country actually found that in some of the poorer areas there were lower rates of severe disability than some of the richer areas. But that's because those children in that study were just much more likely to die from the conditions that were creating disability in the richer parts of the country. So there are many reasons why prevalence estimates can differ, that are based on the approach, the definition, the quality of the implementation, and underlying real reasons why disability itself might be different. And so when we look at those estimates, we really need to evaluate them for how the data is collected and what might be the underlying factors driving disability in order to compare them. And we don't really expect the prevalence estimates to be the same everywhere. And we don't ever really expect them to be the same, even from two surveys within the same country. It's never going to be exactly the same, and it's better to try to understand why and to interpret the data in light of what we know about how the data is being collected. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. I think you've given us a really good review of all the many reasons that these disability rates would vary, from kind of major things across countries that are very different to even when you're looking within a country and trying to hold constant the kind of conceptual framework with which you're approaching disability. We all know that there are very different models and conceptualizations of disability. And even when you're trying to hold those consistent, there are a lot of reasons why one data source might differ from another. And I think even as we'll see in the next presentations, how much they differ can also differ by different data sources and also by different countries. So thank you for that. I'm going to now turn the floor and give the floor to Sophie, who will present some comparisons of disability estimates across different data sources in some sample countries, and also show how this might affect how we might use this data, for example, through disaggregation. Sophie?
Thank you very much, Jennifer. So my name is Sophie Mitra. I'm at Fordham University, and I'm going to be sharing some results that illustrate some of the points that Dan just made. And those results are from the Disability Data Initiative. So Disability Data Initiative is an international partnership of researchers in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia, Europe, North America, and Latin America. You have a QR code on the screen if you want to check out our website. The website is https://www.disabilitydatainitiative.org. And I'm going to share results from our databases. So our databases are accessible through the menu at the top, if you click on databases. So first, I'm going to illustrate the point that Dan made around questions on disability being different across data sources. So in first trend of our work in the Disability Statistics Questionnaire Review database, we have reviewed the disability questions in 3,600 censuses and household surveys in 206 countries, and we've looked out for questions on functional difficulties. So these are the Washington Group short set of questions, the 6 questions on difficulty seeing, difficulty hearing, for instance, as well as other functional difficulty questions. So these are questions that at least meet the recommended guidelines of the United Nations for disability questions in population and housing censuses. So why focus on functional difficulty questions? our focus on these questions is because they are considered to be internationally comparable, especially the Washington Group short set that was tested in many different contexts around the world. So we are interested in finding such questions so then they can be used for disability disaggregation across countries. So what we find overall is that the Washington Group short set question is increasingly included in data sets across all regions of the world, but especially in sub-Saharan Africa and the Pacific as well. However, we do find that other functional difficulty questions are also common. So other functional difficulty questions can be different in several ways. So they may have only questions about the 4 core domains, seeing, hearing, walking, and cognition, and perhaps don't have questions on communication or self-care. But they may have questions on the 6 domains of the Washington Group short set, and yet they have questions that are differently worded. And these differently worded questions could drive differences in prevalence estimates between different data sources. So for instance, in the Malawi census of 2018, the cognitive and the communication questions are worded differently compared to the Washington Group short set. Instead of asking about difficulty concentrating and remembering, as in the short set, for instance, it asks about difficulty learning new things or solving problems or remembering. And for the communication questions, it simply asks about difficulty speaking. So such differences could drive differences in prevalence estimates. But even when we find that the exact same questions are used, so when we use data sets that do have the Washington Group short set, we still end up with differences in prevalence estimates. So in the DDI's other database, the Disability Statistics Estimates database, that is also accessible through our website, we have disaggregated statistics. So far on the website, you'll find estimates for 40 countries. Soon we'll be adding results for 25 more countries. And we have produced prevalence estimates as well as disaggregated estimates for a variety of indicators, demographics, education, health, personal activities, standard of living, insecurity. Now, for 13 countries, we have more than one data set. So we've been able to compare the results of both prevalence estimates as well as disability disaggregated indicators across different data sets for the same country. And I'll give you 2 examples. I'll focus on 2 examples, Senegal and South Africa. So for Senegal, we have 2 data sets. We have the general census of population of 2013, and we've analyzed a 10% systematic sample of that census. We also have the demographic and health survey, the 2018 DHS, which has a stratified sample based on the census of 2013 that I'm going to compare to. And then for South Africa, we also have a census from 2011 and 2 surveys here. Again, a DHS and also the community survey. So both of these surveys are also based on the sampling frame of the census I'm going to make comparison with. So the advantages here is that we have the same disability questions, and we're comparing results from a census and from surveys. Of course, they're 5 years apart, so these could drive some of the differences we find. So here first, some prevalence estimates for Senegal. In the census, the prevalence estimate is 2.1. So this is for adults age 15 and above. So 2.1 in the census, in the survey, 4.7%. So a 2.6 percentage point difference and it's higher in the survey. So in the survey, it's more than twice as high as in the census. And then this difference is also found for subgroups of the population, for men and women separately, rural and urban residents separately, and for the 4 age groups separately. But it's even larger for the oldest age group, so ages 65 and older. In the survey, the prevalence is almost 25%. In the census is 12%. So this is for Senegal. For South Africa, we have a similar result in the sense that the prevalence estimates are higher in the surveys compared to the census. So in the community survey, it's 4.9%, DHS 6.6%, compared to 4% in the census. And then we have this same difference found for all subgroups of the adult population. The difference is less striking than for Senegal, but it's still statistically significant between each survey and the census. So why is there such difference? So there could be many reasons, as we heard earlier, but one possibility we were able to look into is different sample composition across the data sets. So here on the left part of the screen, we compare the percentage of women and men in the census versus the DHS for Senegal. And same thing, percentage of urban versus rural residents, percentage of each age group, the household mean size. So to check if we're getting at the same population characteristics across the data sources. So for Senegal, we can see that in the DHS, we have more women in our sample. We have 56.6% women versus 51.9% in the census. We also have more rural residents in the DHS, 52% versus 49.7% in the census. We also have more older adults in the DHS. And these results are also found in the South Africa data sets with more women, more older adults, and more rural residents, at least for the DHS. So here it shows that the surveys and the census could be capturing slightly different demographics, and these differences could be driving some of the differences in prevalence estimates. Definitely having significantly more older adults in the DHS in Senegal, as we see here, could be a driver for the larger prevalence estimates through the DHS compared to the census. But now, so with these two data sets, although we do have different prevalence estimates, the disability gaps, how are the disability gaps? So when we disaggregate indicators such as educational attainment here, so here I'm focusing on the percentage of adults who have completed primary school or higher in Senegal. So what do we find? Well, we do find a disability gap in both the census and the DHS. Overall, persons with disabilities are less likely to have completed primary education than persons without disabilities. The disability gap is larger with the census than with the DHS, but overall they are consistent. Similarly, for South Africa, we do find that persons with disabilities are less likely to have completed primary school or higher. And we do find a disability gap that is overall consistent across the three data sets, around 29 percentage points for the census and the community survey, and 35 percentage points for the DHS. If we move to another indicator, so assets owned by household, so We have data on a bunch of assets like a car, having a cell phone, a landline, etc. And we compare the percentage owned by households depending on the household disability status. Here, the disability gap tends to be very small across countries. Here, for Senegal, we do find a disability gap of 1.8 percentage point. With the census, there's no disability gap for the DHS, so a slight difference here. For Senegal, we do find a disability gap in the percentage of assets owned, and it's between 3 and 6 percentage points across data sets, but overall giving the same message that persons with disabilities tend to live in households with fewer assets. Now, what about outcomes for the overall population when we compare across the data sets for each of the two countries? So here we're not talking about disaggregating by disability status. We're simply comparing the percentage of adults who have completed primary school or higher, or completed secondary school or higher for all adults. And we do the same for assets owned as well as adequate housing. That's about having an adequate roof, wall quality or floor quality for households overall among adults age 15 and above. So for the overall population, when we compare results from a census and a survey, so here for Senegal, we do find differences across data sets. So here in the DHS, we find a lower percentage of adults with primary school completion or higher by 5 percentage points. And similarly for South Africa, we do find significant differences, smaller, but significant differences nonetheless. And a similar result is found for assets owned and adequate housing. So what this means is that even when we do not disaggregate by disability status, or we don't focus on disability prevalence, but we move to other indicators, there are differences between across data sources, and yet these estimates are routinely produced and included in census and survey reports and used widely. So overall, while the WGSS is increasingly adopted in population and housing censuses and household surveys, we find that many data sets have differently worded questions and sometimes answer scales, and that could be driving differences in prevalence estimates. And even when the same exact questions are used, in our case, the Washington Group short set, we do find prevalence estimates that vary, and that sample compositions can contribute to these varying prevalence estimates. However, overall disability disaggregated estimates are consistent across data sources based on our work across countries. Thank you very much. I hope the time was not overextended.
No, you were perfect, actually. All the speakers have been keeping to time. Thank you so much, Sophie. It's good to see this kind of progression to kind of the big reasons why disability prevalence estimates might differ that Dan provided, kind of starting with between country estimates due to the characteristics of the country, kind of down through all of the conceptual and methodological things that are going on, kind of then focusing in where we have the most control, where we're using the same questions, supposedly using the same implementation instructions, for example, with the Washington Group short set within the country, but we're still getting differences. And, why would that be? And how do we interpret those? And I think it kind of takes us on a very important journey from things that we understand and can control, things like, who's the respondent and who's the universe and what are the questions, down to, well, what are the differences when all of those things are controlled? And we still do see those differences, and some of them might actually be larger than the ones that you showed, because other research has shown that if you, and Dan mentioned, if you ask the disability questions in a health survey, something only focused on health, you will get very different estimates. You show the demographic and health survey, so that's part of it. But if you put them in like a labor force survey, they'll even be lower. So the magnitude of these differences will vary by the nature of the data collection that the questions are asked in. And it's interesting to see those differences, as well as the fact that you would expect there would be more of an impact on the disaggregations, but in fact, there is less of that, which gives you some confidence that even though the prevalences might be varying, you're picking up a reasonable comparable population when you're doing your comparison. So thank you very much for that presentation. We're now going to turn to our panel. And the panel was tasked with trying to give some guidance on how to navigate these differences in disability data. And before I turn to the panel, I wanted to just give just a very brief review of some of the main points that were raised by our two previous speakers. And so if I could have the first slide, please. I think our normal reaction, whether we are survey people, data people, or policy people, if we see different prevalence estimates using the same data collection methods in the same country, our initial reaction is to say that at least all but one of them are wrong, that something went wrong in those data collections, and there's one right estimate. We just need to figure out which it is. However, I think what we have seen that the differences in the prevalence estimates are actually reflecting very valid conceptual variations and their associated methodologic variations. And on this slide, just kind of giving a very brief overview of what those are. I didn't list all of them because there are too many, but just to give you some idea of what those are. The main thing I think are conceptual models of disability do vary, as do approaches to identify the population with disability. And this reflects the complexity of disability. Disability is probably one of the more complex concepts that we're asked to collect data on. And the data that are collected are done so to address very different analytic and policy objectives. There are a lot of different questions that underlie our collection of disability data. All of them have to deal with identifying the population with disabilities, but because they all have a different focus and a different intent, that they will identify that population differently. And that is not an error. That is a reflection of true differences in analytic approach, conceptual approach, and conceptual definitions. The fact that we have differences in demographic characteristics in the samples of these different surveys is actually something I was a little surprised to see, kind of assuming that many of these surveys would be kind of weighting their data to match something like the census. But there's a fair amount of variability in these demographics that are associated with disability. And I think this is a particular source of variation that has not really been thought of before. And I thank Sophie for being able to show that. Especially the relationship with age, because the relationship with disability with age is so strong. And if you have a survey that has many more older people in it, you are going to get higher estimates, and that's very easy to understand. Can I get the next slide, please? So given all of these differences in method, in concept, in definition, in need for the data, in the analytic and policy questions that we're asking, it should not be surprising to us that we have a very complex disability data landscape, and it is inherently complex. And I think that's important because I think it suggests that we are not going to get rid of it. It is something that will be with us for forever. Disability affects all aspects of life, and therefore we need to have multiple data collections to address the policy and research questions that are being asked. There's not going to be one survey. If we need information on employment, we need to go to an employment survey. If we want education, we will go to an education survey. If we need something on housing, we'll go to a housing survey. There will have to be multiple data collections that provide the underlying data to address the policy issues related to disability. And all of those surveys are going to have different designs and produce somewhat different estimates, even if they reuse the same questions. I think it's not possible to have the same kind of consistency in data collection that we would need to be sure that we are not introducing any methodologic differences. The fact that these policy, program, and research needs vary is also related to the fact that they will want to use different definitions of disability and different approaches to identifying the population with disability. That they will use a definition that meets their needs given their research question. I think Dan mentioned this when he was talking about where do you put the cut point, and this was also in the video. Certain policy questions will require a different cut point than other policy questions, even if the main question itself is the same. So we need to expect a lack of consistency in these estimates. We will probably never be able to get them all the same, and perhaps they shouldn't be the same because they are addressing different aspects of disability. So if they are accepted, we don't assume that they're in error. Some might be in error, of course, but we wouldn't assume that they'd be in error. Then we have to figure out how to deal with this very messy, inherently complicated data landscape. It was also very interesting to see that there is variations in estimates and of other indicators, that this is not unique to disability. Things as common as employment and education and adequacy of housing. These are very common indicators used all the time and have levels of differences across these data sets that were similar in magnitude to the disability prevalence. Why is it that there is no, the level of concern in this variation is not the same as the level of concern that we see with disability? There's a great deal of concern with variation in estimates of disability prevalence. Doesn't appear to be as great concern with variations in other of these measures. Why not? And how do these other topic areas deal with this variation might be useful for us to look at in how we start addressing our own complexity in our data landscape and incorporate that into how we present our data. So the task for our panel is how do we effectively interpret and use data from these various data sources. And I think the main objective is also to increase people's comfort level with these estimates and not assume that there's something in error in them. So I'm going to like now to welcome our speakers, Dan and Sophie, and as well as Elizabeth Lockwood to the panel. I am going to propose questions to them. Each panelist will get a question, but I invite the other panelists to also provide their insights as well as part of that their answer, and then we will open it up for the Q&A. So, Dan, I have the first question is for you. As a data user, you are interested in the prevalence of disability. How would you determine which data source to use?
Okay. If the thing I was primarily interested in was the prevalence of disability on a national level, I'd have to go to the census because it tries to reach everybody in the country. And it is the it is the data source which is used for those sort of national estimates. But I would have to recognize the sort of potential limitations of the prevalence estimate I'm generating, right? I mean, a census is because it's expensive and a big operation, you have to have a small number, the smallest number of questions possible, which is why the Washington Group short said it's only six. So it's the estimate I would use for international comparability of prevalence estimates across countries. But I would recognize that it's under-identifying people with psychosocial disabilities. It's under-identifying children with developmental disabilities. I can't get at that in the census. There's not enough space. But if I'm forced to say, what am I going to use to look at prevalence? It would be the census. But I think it's more important to be looking at patterns of prevalence. Is it more common based on age or gender or what have you? What are the gaps and outcome indicators? Is there a poverty gap? Is there education gap? I feel those statistics are a lot more important than the sort of overall prevalence rate. But everybody wants to know the overall prevalence rate, and it's not like of no interest. So I would use the census.
If you notice that there was big differences between, the census and let's say a health survey, um, and of course, census gives you small area, which most surveys don't.
Right.
I mean, is there a way that you can kind of, would there be instances where you would think maybe using the health survey would be better for a prevalence estimate?
I mean, just in terms of its relationship to health outcomes, then
Yeah.
yeah, but uh, I mean, what might be interesting is if I had the Washington Group short set on the census, and then on my health survey, I was able to ask more questions. I could ask the extended set and the child set and other questions like that. Then I could say, then I could have some insight into who might be being missed by the census, and interpret the census prevalence rate. Uh, Sort of in relation to into that. For example, if I found out in the health survey that there's a lot of people with psychosocial disabilities that don't seem to be being captured by the six Washington short set questions, I can say, okay, my prevalence using in the census was 6%, but I suspect that it might be 8 or 9 because it's missing those people. I mean, I couldn't say that with any kind of statistical precision, unfortunately, but at least it would give me an indication of where my underestimate might be because of the limitations of the census. But but still, yeah, you have to fall back on the census. There's no one data source that answers all your questions, right? That's the key.
I don't know if any of the other panelists want to add anything to that. Um, Please just jump in if you do. I guess just one final mention on this. It seems that given that the estimates are sensitive to the questions asked and the survey asked, do you think it would be useful for users if the source of the prevalence estimate was always mentioned, so that if you're doing publishing a number, you just don't say the prevalence is X%. You kind of
I,
add,
I
it's
would
coming
like
from this survey.
I would like it for the source and the method. In other words, according to this survey, according to this census that used the Washington Group six questions, plus an additional two questions on albinism and depression or whatever, this was the survey using this cutoff. I mean, so that I have a sense of that. And then if it looks odd to me, I can go into the metadata and say, well, was there a screen or how was it translated? If something seems really off, I would then want to sort of investigate what might be some of the factors that led to an estimate which seems odd to me.
Right. Yeah. I think that's a good rule of thumb that we should, in presenting data and also reading about data, always be aware of the source of the data and how the definition was developed. Thank you. Okay, my second question is for Sophie, where here you're interested in disaggregating outcome data by disability as opposed to just reporting the prevalence. And how do you choose which data source to use for that?
Okay, thank you. That's a great question. And I'd like to note that that's a good problem to have, right? Which data set to choose from. It's not a problem we used to have. It used to be that there were so few data sets with disability questions, there was no choice. So now we have a good problem, which data source to pick. So there's not going to be a single data source that is best fitted to disaggregate indicators. In general, it's going to depend on the scope of your work, the objectives of your analysis, whether it's the geographic scope of the work. So if you're doing a cross-country analysis, I would say that you want to go towards data sources that have functional difficulty questions, and in particular, internationally tested question sets on disability, such as the Washington Group short set. If you're focusing on a single country, maybe you don't have that constraint. Now, it's also your choice of data source is going to depend a lot on your topic of interest, and so on the indicators that you are going to disaggregate. So if you are interested in a specialized topic, say reproductive health, like access to family planning, then the demographic, so I'm thinking still about Senegal and South Africa and the comparison of the data source there that I mentioned earlier. So for these countries, the demographic and health survey is going to be the most obvious data set of choice if you're focusing on family planning. These indicators on family planning are not generally available in other data sources, and that's the strength of the DHS. But if you're looking for data on demographics, say the percentage of persons who live alone in Senegal and South Africa, disaggregated by disability status, I would choose the census. Now, for some indicators, the choice could be more challenging. Say for an employment indicator like the employment rate. So ideally, we would like to use data from labor force surveys. To our knowledge, in Senegal and South Africa, there's no labor force survey data set that has the Washington Group short set or similar questions. So what do we use instead? So in the DDI's disability statistics estimates, so while we have produced employment rates from all data sets that we have on our interactive platform, then we had to choose which one to show as a default estimate for the disaggregated employment rates. So which one do we show for Senegal, for instance, or for South Africa? So in general, we tend to go towards the census instead of the DHS or other specialized surveys that are not labor force surveys. And why is that? It's because the censuses have very large sample sizes, so they make disaggregation possible by severity, or by disability, and also by severity and disability type. So it gives us samples that are not too small, and it also makes it possible for us to produce the disaggregated estimates at the subnational level. So that's why we've gone towards the censuses. So overall, there is not a single data source that is going to be best for disaggregated indicators. It really depends on the scope of the analysis and its goals.
Thank you, Sophie. It sounds like this answer is very similar to some of the others, that you'd pick your data source, your cutoff, to best meet your analytic objectives and the availability of data, which, as you say,
absolutely,
happily is getting more available than it was. It is I guess we should be thankful that we have to make choices now that we didn't have to make before. Thank you. I'm going to now ask my third question to Elizabeth. Maybe the hardest question, sorry. How can we communicate to data users as well as the public and other stakeholders about variations in disability prevalence estimates? How do NSOs approach to this versus NGOs or OPDs, for example?
Thank you, Jennifer. I'll answer this the best I can. I have taken some learnings from a report I worked on for Open Data Watch on intersectionality data and persons with disabilities. So, really, from organizations of persons with disabilities themselves. First, we really need to show data availability and indicate gaps in relation to different disability groups. I think this is especially important, which is missing very often. We also need to see which of these groups are more likely to be less visible in the data and more marginalized, especially underrepresented groups of persons with disabilities. Second, we need to share the data in different languages, and this includes national sign languages and other minority languages, as well as alternate formats. And this is especially important because you want to ensure the data that are reflected of a certain community, that they reach that community. We need to, and this is so important, even more so today, when sharing data, ensure the safety and protection of the disability community. Often, disability communities are smaller, so it is easier to identify community members, not always in larger surveys and censuses, but it is still possible. And one way to address this is to, if possible, ensure communities have ownership of this data over time and throughout the data value chain. Fourth, prevalence rates can be communicated using data storytelling. This is more and more popular. This can be done by locating a story in the data itself and then highlighting the story with key messages. And I won't go into it because we don't have a lot of time. A fifth, and this is so important, data need to be communicated in an accessible way. And this can be done very simply by just using simple language, avoiding jargon, idioms, structuring data logically, use high contrast fonts, provide multiple formats, ensure assistive technology is accessible, test with persons with disabilities, and consult with organizations of persons with disabilities for all publications and dissemination. And I'll just finish with an example to answer your second question of how an OPD shared data that really affected policy change. The OPD is the Las Piñas Persons with Disability in Las Piñas, Philippines. They are a very large OPD cross-disability entity. They collected their own data in Las Piñas of their community of persons with disabilities, and then they shared and presented this data to local authorities. And they really emphasized unemployment rate, and it was quite high. And immediately following the presentation, the local authorities allocated 400 places for unemployed persons with disabilities in Las Piñas. And this was a great win and a very good example of the OPD showing the data, showing the gaps, and then affecting this policy change. And I will finish here and share the link to the report I mentioned earlier. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Just a quick follow-up. In terms of the presenting national data, for example, from census or surveys, how much of an issue is it that some of them do vary by data source within the same country in terms of using the data for advocacy or for policy? And is there something that the national agency, whether it's the NOSO or somebody else, who is collecting that data can do to make it easier for others to use the data?
I think I'll answer your question in a different way because it's a very hard question.
I told you it was hard.
If national statistical offices and organizations of persons with disabilities work together from the very beginning and throughout the process, I think you will address a lot of these issues. And we do see great examples in Ghana, in Colombia, in Kenya, where this is working. So I think if we can emphasize that practice, that would be one very good solution.
I think that's an excellent answer. And I think does speak to kind of informing through the whole process and why we're doing it, why a collection is being done the way it's doing, and what it's supposed to ask. It makes it a lot easier to use it at the end than if you just say, well, we did it and here it is, and now you try to make sense of it. So I think it does become more of a organic, for want of a better word, process. Okay, before we open this up for questions, and I have some help, people are gonna have been looking at the chat, kind of coming up with this pulling together the questions, and we're going to ask them. We have one more slide to show because one of the ways to address some of these differences is through something called data harmonization, where you may have different data sets, different ways of asking about disability um, across surveys, but you try to have some consistency across surveys in terms of how this is approached. And one way to do this is to always include at least a core set. Our friends at a CIP have just posted one of their disability policy insights, insight number 6, which is on data harmonization. And in this report, they analyze how to improve data harmonization and why it is key to improving disability research and policy development, as well as providing recommendations for policy. And I think if we had more consistency across data collections, wouldn't give us complete consistency in output. We've already seen that that is not going to happen, but it does give us a tool to look at and better understand some of the differences that result from different conceptualizations, different methodologies, different implementation strategies. So I encourage you to look at this policy insight. You can access it through scanning the QR code. There's going to be a link in the chat, or just go to the CIP website and you can download it from there. So just very opportune that they've just finished this policy insight and posted it on their website. So thank you, CIP, for that. So we're now going to have some question and answers, and I'm hoping that somebody is going to feed the questions, because I have not been had a hard time looking at the chat.
I can read some of the questions. The first one, just 1 second.
Sure. Thank you, Monica.
Sorry. There is one that says the census data is often very old. How can we ensure that people with disabilities have been taken into account as full as possible?
Any of the panel members can respond to any of the questions. I encourage you to put your cameras on. So
Can I jump in?
please go right ahead.
I think we are seeing some changes and very encouraging developments with the 2020 round of censuses. And actually, in our questionnaire reviews, we have found that increasingly the censuses include the Washington Group short set. So there's a lot of work in terms of having to analyze the recent censuses. But I would say that in general, we do have more and more and very recent census results. So for instance, I focused on Senegal and I showed you 2013 results, but we also have results from the 2023 census in Senegal. So I think we don't have this, we have this problem less than we used to, actually. Yeah.
And if I could just add in, when it comes to children, the mix, the multiple indicator cluster survey that's supported by UNICEF has been done in many, many countries, all using the child functioning module. So we actually have pretty consistent data collected on childhood disability in many countries. It's not census data, but it is probably the best estimates of sort of globally consistent estimates of childhood disability by country. So that's only been available really in the last few years.
But I'd add that, prevalence don't change that much. Censuses are done only every 10 years, usually sometimes every 5. And so even if data come out quite quickly, you have to wait another, maybe 8 years to get more data. The prevalences do change, but not as quickly. What can change more quickly are the disaggregations, I think, because if you're instituting policy changes, you would hope that within a couple of years you'll see some outcome changes. And there, yeah, you may have to use other data sources that really focus on the outcomes that the policy changes are focusing on, for example, employment, If you have disability indicators and employment survey, you can do this, and those are done all the time. So again, I think it's pick the data source that fits your needs, and then determine whether the age of that data source really affects whether your analytic capabilities. Amen. Another question, Monica?
Yes, there is another question that says, do any data collection measure the need for help from other people or the inability to work outside the home from family members who are caregivers?
Yeah. Actually, Monica should probably be answering this question since she recently did a review of the questions that ask this. But yeah, there are surveys that do ask about uh, care and support, provision of care and support. Household income and expenditure surveys ask about um, the work experience, the work behavior of everyone in the household. There are time use surveys that are available in some countries that ask about the time that's spent doing that. There are surveys, and actually, Monica recently and Maria and Pereira from CIP we recently did a report for ILO looking at what are the questions you ask to get at those particular types of issues, and hopefully that'll be available soon.
Okay. Another question is like, what do you recommend when one person has multiple types of disability registered?
Well, I mean, if you're just trying to get at prevalence, then it doesn't matter really, right? I mean, does the person cross the threshold of having enough difficulties functioning that they're but if you're interested in what are the kinds of services, care and support, goods and services that people need, then you would have to, then I think the right approach is asking those questions, instead of assuming that people with this and this and this difficulty need such and such. Questions that ask about what are the goods and services needed. And there are, again, that's a whole other set of questions and approach to data collection that is starting to happen. Kenya just had a national survey on care and support needs. The Model Disability Survey asks about that in terms of the access to healthcare. But yeah, I think, and then different disability assessments for the provision of goods and services, I think, are trying to move towards that. That's a different kind of data collection. It's administrative data for the implementation of programs, but that are beginning to collect data on what are the goods and services needed by people, what are the support that people need, and that is going to be a function of the various types and combinations of difficulties that people have.
What we were talking about today is really one estimate of a prevalence of overall disability that, based on one approach, the Washington Group is having a level of difficulty in at least one domain at a particular cutoff. Even those 6 questions you can put together in multiple ways to describe the functional status of that population, whether it's a severity indicator, or how many domains is their problems and the level of severity in the domains. So in terms of cutoff, the international cutoff is a lot, but there's also been, I think, very reasonable suggestion that some in 2 domains might be equivalent to a lot in 1 domain in terms of how it impacts the ability to participate in society. So once you get beyond this very simple yes, no, you have a disability, you don't, that's the prevalence, then it opens up a myriad of other questions that you have to ask about how to put the data together. And that is, I think, a much more interesting conversation, actually, than dealing with just the overall prevalence, but also much more complicated. Sophie, I think you wanted to get in here.
I think you said what I was going to say, that if a person has multiple disability types, you can, if you're concerned about disaggregating indicators, you can disaggregate it in terms of whether they have a single or more than one disability type, as well as by severity. So I think, yeah, we have now a lot of data to be able to generate insights for these subgroups of the disabled community.
I've sometimes said that, disability statistics, when it's going to come of age, when we have all these complexities, that we have data to address all of these complexities. And I think we do. And as I think Dan mentioned, the actual prevalence, the overall prevalence is where we start, but it's not where we end. We then have to take that and go beyond it and get into much more detail and description about the actual status of people and their ability to participate. So this is really just the simplest part. And even here we have issues, but I think we can deal with these if we understand them, which is what we tried to do today. I did
Right.
see a question. I'm sorry, Dan, go ahead.
I was going to say, just very briefly, disability is really complex, right? So you can't expect one number or two numbers to be able to capture what you're interested in. I know that it's frustrating to get into the weeds with all the complexity. It's our job as the statisticians to try to boil it down to its essentials and make it understandable. But there's never going to be one or two numbers that's going to describe the situation.
And even those numbers will be somewhat messy by the
And right,
nature
and even
of
those numbers will be
disability. I did see one question, and we have maybe time for one more in the chat, which says, "So what does this mean about for the 16%?" And I think, well, maybe we should end on that. If going back to the beginning, and I'll start here, that 16% is based on a particular approach, particular set of questions, and a particular cutoff, and is a probably reasonable estimate of the population having those characteristics. And one can call that the population, the prevalence with disability. It is as Dan said earlier, it's an average. It's not going to apply everywhere. If it comes from a survey that is very complicated, so it doesn't get done very often. If you want to use it as kind of a benchmark, if you keep in mind how it was developed, it can be quite useful. But it also is not, there is not one number. And that one number has a pedigree. And when you give that number, you should give its pedigree. Where did it come from? How is it calculated? What's the cutoff? And it may be your starting point. It may not be very useful for your purposes. So I think there's, again, back to there is no one number. And any number you come up with, you have to explain how you got there.
So I'm not going to say the country, but a big survey was done in a country using a particular method, and it came up with 80%, 80% of the people had a disability, but I forget what it is now, 10 or 12% had, they said, what a significant disability. It turns out that 10 or 12% was pretty similar to what the Washington group questions got. Doesn't mean the 80% number is meaningless. To call 80% of the population having a disability is probably very problematic, but it meant that 80% of the people had some sort of functional difficulty doing something, right? So if I draw the cutoff all the way there, now if I'm designing a public transportation system that has to be fully accessible to everybody, knowing that 80% of the population has some sort of issue, that might be important to me. But for running a disability program, no, it's not going to be the 80%, right? It's going to be your cutoff's going to be different relative to that program. So it's always important to know where the cutoff was drawn and why it was drawn that way, and whether you think that particular cutoff is the one that's relevant to you for your purposes.
We are running a little bit over. I think we were supposed to end at a quarter after the hour. So I want to give our speakers and panelists opportunity for last words. If not, I want to thank the speakers and panelists for joining us today. I want to thank all of you who have attended. We really appreciate the fact that you've joined us. I want to thank the interpreters. I know we spoke too quickly. I apologize for that. And again, thank CIP and Paulina for organizing this. So if there are any last words from Dan, Sophie, or Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for organizing.
Thank you. And let me just say that if you go to the Washington Group website, you'll find a frequently asked questions section and also a blog that answers a lot of frequently asked questions in a little more detail. So I think you might find out that hopefully will answer some of the questions that we weren't able to get to.
Thank you all again. We will be sending out the recording and hopefully some other material on questions we didn't get to and some summaries of what we discussed. If you are interested in learning more about this, I encourage you to contact us at the Washington Group. You can send messages through our website. We'd like to continue the conversation in a way that is be most useful to you. So we need to hear from you about what else you would like to hear and what else we could do to be helpful on this topic. So thank you, everyone. Have a pleasant morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are. And we hope to see you again in another one of these webinars. Thank you very much. Bye.